There was a guy sitting just a few seats away. I didn't think much of it at first. People sneak in to watch dress rehearsals all the time. But this guy was wearing really old clothes, like something out of the Old West. I
Stage
thought
wall,
that was
stage wall.
weird, but then again, this is the drama department. Maybe he was in costume or something. Anyway, I went back to shooting. After a few more minutes, I looked back to the guy. And this time he turned toward me and kind of nodded, just sort of friendly. And then turned back to the stage.
1 and 2, 1 and 2, 1 and 2.
I nodded back, but then I noticed something. The seat he was sitting on. It wasn't down. These were those old auditorium seats that stay up until you push them down to sit on them. And his was still up. In fact, the more my eyes adjusted,
Someone is defusing.
I realized I couldn't see his legs. I couldn't really see anything from the chest down. And then as soon as I realized that,
Nice.
he just disappeared right in front of me. To this day, I still can't explain what I saw in that balcony.
Deep breaths, everyone.
It almost doesn't really even qualify as a theory because this is obviously what people think of when they think of ghosts. They think
By
of
wall
spirits
stage.
of dead people. And this, of course, is contingent on the possibility of the consciousness continuing after death, which is a whole can of worms inside of a Pandora's box. Now, obviously, a lot of you out there believe that that's not true, that when you die, that's the end. Others may go by the religious conventions of heaven, hell, and purgatory, and that ghosts are maybe spirits that are trapped here for one reason or another, or maybe there's some kind of waiting period before you move on. And others may not necessarily believe in the religious notions of heaven and hell and purgatory and all that, but think the consciousness might continue through, quantum weirdness, quantum entanglement, and the, super conscious fabric underlying the reality of the universe. However you slice it, the idea of ghosts of dead spirits interacting with us through another plane of existence is a narrative gift that just keeps on giving. The storytelling possibilities are endless. Beetlejuice pictures the afterlife as a bureaucratic nightmare. The Frighteners as a playground for pranksters and scam artists. Defending your life as the great grand jury in the sky, and Ghost, well, you can bang a dead guy through Whoopi Goldberg. In each of these and countless other scenarios, there's an element of unfinished business, of trying to right wrongs and make sense of your life and looking back over the choices that you've made. Often these stories are about letting go. Letting go of fear, letting go of obligations, letting go of loved ones, letting go of this world, essentially, before you cross over to the other plane of existence and reconnect all over again. There's always a theme of isolation in these stories, of being disconnected from what you think matters before realizing that what you think matters doesn't really matter, and that by only letting go can you be free. Narratively, it can help explain why ghosts are trapped in certain locations, and obviously it takes away the sting of knowing that we have death waiting for us in the future, our own mortality. And ultimately, the real experiences people have aside, you have to ask the question, does our belief in ghosts and the afterlife in general just stem from that ever-present fear of our own mortality?
Well.
Is this what gets us up in the morning and allows us to go on and live our lives? I'll just let that hang in the air for now.
Seriously? Sage, what type of wall is this, man? What type of wall is this,
My
man?
mom was diagnosed with MS, and as her symptoms progressed, I moved into her apartment to take care of her. Over the years, she became bedridden, and I had to do everything for her. She would call my name, and I'd come help her, even just to grab something that was just out of reach. Anyway, years went by, and the disease took its toll on her, and eventually she died, right there in that bed. I moved out and tried to go on with my life, eventually got married and bought a new home. We hired a painter to help redo the kitchen, and one day we got to talking. I told him how we just moved into this house, and I mentioned that I used to live at that apartment complex. He knew exactly which complex I was talking about because his company paints the apartments there when people move out. I told him which apartment was mine and when I moved out, and he said, "Yeah, I painted that apartment." We had a laugh about it, like, what are the odds, right? Then he remembered something. It was the weirdest thing, he said. I was working there one day, and I swear I heard no woman calling out from the bedroom. It said the name Kevin. I could hear it clear as day. My breath hung in my throat, and I almost dropped my paintbrush. It took him a second to connect the dots. He looked at me, too weirded out to even speak. I told him about my mom, how she died in that room. He was so freaked out he had to take a smoke break.
Needling, Sage. Sage, needling.
This was a popular idea back in the day when I was doing the ghost hunting thing, and the basic idea is that ghosts aren't necessarily spirits of dead people walking around and interacting with us, but it's more like a movie being played back. In other words, strong emotions can kind of become imprinted on a location, and then later on somebody else can pick up that imprint under the right conditions. This became known as the stone tape theory. So, you know, a man or a woman buys a house, maybe spends a lot of time fixing it up. They really love this house. They have a lot of, you know, wonderful memories in this house. They kind of leave a mental imprint there.
We have to win
of
race
their
round, man.
emotions.
We have
And
to
then
win
later on,
race
somebody else
round
buys this
somehow.
house, and they move in, and they're able to sort of pick up on that mental imprint. The brain might pick that up as just sort of a presence of somebody else being there, or it might actually manifest it as a person standing on the other side of the room in your mind's eye. Or if some scary or traumatic experience happened there, then somebody might have a more frightening encounter. This, of course, relies on the possibility that a mental imprint can actually be done on a location, which we have absolutely no proof of. But this isn't too far away from what the Global Consciousness Project was working on, basically the idea that human emotions can affect patterns in random number generators. So while this is far from proven, there are definitely researchers out there that are looking into the possibility that our minds can affect matter and that maybe we could perceive electromagnetic stimuli that don't come from our normal five senses. Extra sensory perception, you might say. My family moved into a home in Bedford, and it came with one of those Ring doorbells installed, which I thought was cool, but it quickly became a pain in the butt because it kept sending me alerts every night that there was somebody at the door at 3 a.m. But then when I checked the camera, there was never anyone there. Obviously, it kind of freaked me out the first few times it happened. After a while, I figured it must just be a glitch, and I learned to ignore it. Anyway, I found myself in a conversation with a friend who also had a Ring doorbell.
right now.
I asked him if he had the same problem. He said no and asked me to pull up the last video it recorded. I played it, and my friend noticed an orb floating past the camera after it came on. I thought it was probably just dust, but then he noticed there was a sound that it recorded. I played it back, and he was right. It sounded like someone talking. I realized I'd never actually listened to the videos before. I turned up the volume and listened to it. The sound was rough, but the voice seemed to say, "I'll kill you." Okay, now we're getting into a much more likely scenario, which is just quite simply, ghosts are hallucinations. For some reason, people get really upset whenever you suggest that maybe they're having a hallucination or something. It's almost like there's a stigma behind it, like mental illness or something like that. But the fact of the matter is, we hallucinate all the time. You could argue that our very conscious experience is a hallucination created by our brain and guided by sensory information. Well, you don't think your brain could conjure up fully realized people that are indistinguishable from the real thing? It happens every night when you dream. Now, I've made the argument before that our brains are just hardwired to create a conscious experience, and in lieu of any sensory information, it just makes stuff up. And that's basically what dreaming is. There's an effect known as pareidolia, where our minds see faces and images in random patterns because it's just evolved that way. We are social animals. When you're a hammer, everything is a nail. When you're a brain, everything is a face. It's like the Google DeepMind videos where it analyzes footage and inserts images of faces and animals and objects into places where its algorithms determine that it looks slightly like a dog's face or a bird or a lizard, etc. And of course, there are times when multiple people see the same thing.
There they are.
Could that be a hallucination? Maybe. We are incredibly open to suggestion, far more so than we want to admit. I did a video a while back on the dancing plague, which was a thing where an entire town of people in Europe started dancing. They felt this overwhelming compulsion to dance to the point that some people even died. And most people look at that as an extreme example of the power of suggestion. And ghosts could be the same thing. Especially if you're in a building that's supposed to be haunted, or if you recently lost a loved one, your brain is primed to look for that. And sometimes the mind sees what it wants to see. I work for a state agency in Pennsylvania, and our offices are in the former Harrisburg State Hospital. And if you don't know what kind of hospital this was, its original name when it was founded in the 1830s was the Pennsylvania State Lunatic Hospital. It's very old and saw a lot of crazy stuff in its time, so of course everybody says it's haunted. Now, I've never really believed in ghosts, so it didn't bother me to work there. But everyone seemed to have a story about some spooky thing that happened to them or someone they know. But I'd never seen anything.
I have the spike.
Until one day, me and several co-workers were on a conference call. We were at a table with the phone in the middle talking to another office over the speaker, when one of my co-workers pointed at the phone cord. It was rolling slowly across the table. We looked at each other to see who was doing this, even showing our hands to each other to prove it wasn't us.
We felt all around the cable to see if there were any
One enemy
strings,
remaining.
checked under the table. Nothing was doing this.
Okay.
And then it just stopped as suddenly as it started. For no reason. We kind of looked at each other and wrapped up the phone call. Afterward, we looked at the cord and tried to make it roll like that again, even twisting
Good
up the
one,
cord
good
and
one, very
leaning the
nice, thank you.
table to see if we could recreate it. And we couldn't. None of us in that room that day could explain what we saw. But we know
Ask
we
me,
all
ask me,
saw
Sage.
it.
I can buy you. Sage, ask me. I can buy you, man. Come here. Man.
I mentioned in previous
Buy
videos
full
of this
shield.
channel the idea of flatland, which
Sage,
Carl Sagan
bro.
actually talked about in one of his episodes of Cosmos, so I attributed it to him. But many, of course, were quick to point out that Flatland is actually a book that was written by Edwin Abbott. So there you go. Correction achieved.
Ain't it,
So the
bro?
basic gist of the thing is that if you lived in a totally flat 2D world and a 3D object sat down on top of that, then all you would see were the lines of that plane that the 3D object was sitting on. And if that object were to pass through the plane, then you would just see that line change shape as the object passed through. Unless you could
Don't
sort
pick,
of
don't pick, don't
interpret
pick. Don't.
plane by plane, kind of slice by slice, like an MRI machine. The flatland
Take my
example
gun,
is often
Sage.
cited as a way to explain how difficult it is to translate a 3D object into 2D space. And the same holds true for, say, a 4D object in 3D space. You know, we do our best with a
Wait,
tesseract
Sage,
to
wait.
explain that, but as
Player
Carl Sagan
standing.
says in his episode of
Spike
Cosmos,
down.
the tesseract really is more of like a 4D shadow
Defenders